I activate the magic card, Monster Reborn.
And now I activate Monster Reborn.
I'll activate the spell card, Monster Reborn.
Monster Reborn, without a doubt one of the single most legendary cards in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! This card is so OG status that they didn't even call it by its proper name for almost the first 30 episodes in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime. It's been banned on 3 separate occasions in the TCG and has appeared numerous times in 5 of the 7 Yu-Gi-Oh! Animated series, including Season 0, Duel Monsters, GX, Zexal, and Arc V. Even people who have quit the game over a decade ago still remember it, and I'd argue right behind Pot of Greed, it's easily Yu-Gi-Oh's most recognizable spell card. In this video, we'll be diving deep into the history of this iconic card, unraveling its origins, complicated past, and even discussing how the card fares in today's game. Welcome to the Yu-Gi-Oh story, the rise and fall of Monster Reborn. The first thing you need to know about Monster Reborn is that the card is as old as the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise itself. It was among the first cards created by Takahashi. In fact, it even appears in both the manga and animated versions of the Toei season of Yu-Gi-Oh, or what most Yu-Gi-Oh fans simply refer to as Yu-Gi-Oh Season 0. It was originally designed as a simple means to revive a destroyed creature, and since the entire concept of duel monsters revolved around monsters battling each other, a card like Monster Reborn not only seemed like a no-brainer for Takahashi to create, but it would also serve as a very convenient card for staging comebacks in the duels in the anime series. In fact, would you believe that Monster Reborn appeared on a staggering 47 episodes of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! DM anime? Unsurprisingly, this makes it one of the most played cards in the series. Monster Reborn was originally released March 2002 in the very first Yu-Gi-Oh! Booster set, Legends of Blue Eyes White Dragon. It was printed as one of the 10 ultra rare cards in this set, alongside other iconic cards from the anime such as Blue Eyes White Dragon, Dark Magician, Red Eyes Black Dragon, and the 5 pieces of Exodia. Being such a mainstay in the DM series, it was inherently going to be popular amongst fans of the show. However, it far exceeded just the anime fans in terms of seeing play in the early days. At the time, Monster Reborn was almost a 100% staple in all Yu-Gi-Oh decks. Players who used the card learned instantly that it was without a doubt one of the strongest cards in the entire game, as it allowed you to special summon any destroyed or tributed monster back onto the field in either attack or defense position. There were no strings attached. You could easily revive back a boss monster or even use your opponent's creatures against them, and all for a single card. In fact, the only reason every duelist with a deck didn't use Monster Reborn had nothing to do with the usefulness of the card itself, but more so with the initial price. Since Monster Reborn was not just a popular anime card, but one of the best cards in the game, it made it more sought after, so not everyone had access to it. However, that problem was completely alleviated when it was reprinted as a common in both the starter deck Kaiba and Yugi just a few weeks later. With everyone in the game now having access to the card and realizing how powerful it was, Konami made a very smart decision to limit the card to 1 on the very first limited list for the TCG, which went into effect May 1st, 2002. As unbelievable as this may sound, there was a 6-week period where players were allowed to run a whopping 3 copies of the card in their deck, and as you might imagine, everyone who could get their hands on a playset used the card, and monsters obviously didn't stay dead for long. As the 4th Yu-Gi-Oh! Booster set, Pharaoh Servant, released, we received 2 more incredibly powerful revival spell and trap cards. The first was an equip spell called Premature Burial, which lets you revive any of your monsters from the graveyard and attack position for the cost of 800 life points. The second was a trap named Call of the Haunted. This card also lets you summon a monster from your grave in attack mode, but for no cost. Usually in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game, when new generic spells and traps are released that do similar things to older cards, they're ever so slightly better. This generally causes the older cards to see less play among duelists because of the competition from the new cards. However, that didn't happen here. Despite being older, Monster Reborn was clearly the best of the 3 revival cards. First off, it didn't require any life point payment. Secondly, it was the only card among the 3 that could summon a monster from either player's graveyard. And lastly, the monster didn't have to be summoned in attack mode, which could leave the door open for defensive strategies. So for all intents and purposes, Monster Reborn was still at the top of the food food chain. However, that would actually lead to the card's downfall. As we moved on through the DM era, it became more and more apparent that Monster Reborn was not only consistently a top 5 card at all times in terms of power and versatility, but the card was progressively getting better. Keep in mind, when it was first released in Legends of Blue Eyes, nearly every monster in the game was a bare bones normal monster with no unique effect. So while Monster Reborn was still in a class of its own, the monsters it could summon back were pretty basic and they were only strong in terms of raw stats. But as more powerful effect monsters like Jinzo, Exile Force, and Tribe Infecting Virus, just to name a few, were released and completely overtook the normal monsters altogether, Monster Reborn just got a better pool of cards to work with. And since Monster Reborn was clearly the best revival card in the game, with essentially no drawbacks or downside, many competitive duelists argued that the card was simply too good and unfair. Ultimately, Konami agreed, and on Yu-Gi-Oh's first true ban list, which went into effect August 25th, 2004, Monster Reborn was one of the 10 cards moved to the forbidden status, thus making it completely illegal for all sanctioned tournament play. But as you might be aware of, that was not the end of Monster Reborn's wild story. Despite appearing in the GX anime nearly 10 times in the first season alone, Monster Reborn doesn't nearly have the legacy in the GX era that it had during DM, and that's for the simple fact that it was banned throughout almost all of it. During the GX era, competitive Yu-Gi-Oh really took off with the regional and Shonen Jump circuits, and people really didn't question why Monster Reborn was banned. Konami already knew that if Monster Reborn was legal, it would be a staple in nearly every deck because they had seen that in the previous era. This is why it was such a shock to everyone in the Yu-Gi-Oh community when on the March 1st, 2008 ban list, Monster Reborn was unbanned and Call of the Haunted actually took its spot on the forbidden list. This was mind-blowing, especially the timing. We had just received the second to last booster set in the GX era in Phantom Darkness, and most of the GX era had been defined by advantage-based, slow-paced duels that were back and forth and very grindy. But Phantom Darkness as a set super accelerated the pace of the game, and predictably, Monster Reborn became an overnight staple the second the new ban list went into effect. Looking back, I'm not sure what Konami's agenda was with this move to unban Monster Reborn and replace it on the ban list with a clearly inferior card, but rest assured, Monster Reborn was exploited immediately. One of the simplest power plays using Monster Reborn involved Armageddon Knight and Dark Magician of Chaos. This is where you would summon Armageddon Knight, dump D-Mock into the graveyard, revive it with Monster Reborn, then use the Magician's effect to add Monster Reborn right back to your hand. This play netted you a huge 2800 attack monster on the field for free. Monster Reborn was also used in everything from the super aggressive Shonen Jump winning 6 Samurai deck that employed it to add even more damage and pressure to their already overwhelming pushes, to the complete opposite side of the spectrum with a deck like Oppression Gadgets. Despite the fact that Monster Reborn and Royal Oppression completely conflicted as cards, Monster Reborn was simply too good and too strong of a card to pass on, so the deck ran it regardless. When we entered the 5Ds era and the Synchro Summon was introduced into the game, Monster Reborn remained a mainstay in decks. Being able to summon any Synchro monster from the graveyard without having to add up levels or even use tuners made the card as valuable as ever and kept it at the top of the food chain in decks like Teledad, Blackwings, and Synchro Cat. This is why it wasn't a huge surprise when Konami banned the card for a second time just 2 formats into the 5Ds era on the September 1st, 2009 FNL list. At this point, many assumed that Reborn would spend another 3 or 4 years forbidden before we ever saw the card again, but that's when Konami pulled another shocker seemingly out of nowhere. Out of the blue, just 1 year later on the September 1st, 2010 ban list, Monster Reborn once again emerged. You could call it deja vu because just like during GX, Konami had set themselves up for failure. On this very same ban list, Infernity Launcher had been limited to 1 as a nerf to the Infernity archetype, as it was essentially a double Monster Reborn for that deck, but the Infernity players just simply threw on Reborn, which served the same purpose. Monster Reborn also raised the ceiling of the Plant Synchro deck that was about to be created and fully unleashed on the Yu-Gi-Oh world with the release of Starstrike Blast that was going to be released just 2 months after this ban list went into effect. This time around, Monster Reborn's stay was pretty extended. Many expected the card to be legal for maybe a year or so at most, but it was actually legal for the rest of the entire 5Ds era. In fact, outside of just 2 formats, Monster Reborn was legal for all of 5Ds, which actually makes it more ironic that it doesn't appear in the anime a single time. As Yu-Gi-Oh became far more archetype dominated during the Zexal era, Monster Reborn's role in meta decks like Windups and Insectors continued to be one of a recovery card and play extender contender, but it became a lot more rare to see players Monster Reborn opponents' monsters. This was because if your opponent was using a different deck than you, it was very unlikely that their monsters would actually synergize with your own or your deck strategy. Right after what many referred to as the Dragon Ruler spellbook format ended, which was one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most iconic or notorious, depending on who you ask, Konami gave us one of the biggest ban lists we had seen in years for the September 2013 FNL list. A whopping 15 cards were banned, and you guessed it, Monster Reborn for a third time was on the chopping block. This is actually, oddly enough, where the OCG and TCG split on their views of the card, as Monster Reborn remained legal in the OCG at 1, and the TCG, however, Monster Reborn would spend the next 4.5 years being banned, meaning it missed out on the Arc V era entirely. It wasn't until the February 2018 ban list that Monster Reborn would return to the TCG for a third and final time. This go around, there really wasn't any guessing that the community had to do, as it came just weeks after Konami announced a new lost art program, which would see TCG players gain access to the original uncensored Japanese artwork of the card for the first time in history. So unbanning it only made sense because they wanted the program to be a success. As for how Monster Reborn has fared since being unbanned in the TCG, it hasn't been anything close to the previous times, where it became an overnight staple in most decks in the game, and that's mainly due to how archetypes are designed nowadays. As I said earlier, the days of just reborning your opponent's biggest monster and just trying to beat them over the head with it to victory, those are long gone. And the real problem that Monster Reborn is having is that almost every archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh that has been designed in the past maybe 5 years or so already has a card or multiple cards that do what Monster Reborn does. And since those cards are specifically designed to work with one deck, usually those cards are searchable within that deck, or they have some type of additional bonus effect. So while Monster Reborn is still as powerful as it was 17 years ago, it's just largely unnecessary with most of today's decks. So this is where our story ends, and now hopefully you understand why I said Monster Reborn had such a complicated past. I really feel like the card was insanely broken upon release, only got better as time went on, and then after being banned, it kind of felt like Konami would just arbitrarily unban and reban the card at random times without any adequate reason, despite the fact that it was pretty obvious it was always going to be a staple every time that they did it. But I guess that is just Konami in a nutshell, and sometimes they just do crazy things that don't make a lot of sense. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this Yu-Gi-Oh story. If you did, give the video a thumbs up. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already, and turn on that notification bell for daily videos.
It's time to finish this duel with Reborn the monster!
Oh no!